Good afternoon. I'm Fraser Mitchell, partner at Shoosmiths. Welcome to today's event, In Conversation with Andy Maciver. As a business, we've run several of these events over the last 12 months, focusing on economic recovery and on politics. We've been very fortunate in each of those previous events to be joined by an expert speaker who's shared their views across a range of issues. And today is no exception. So a quick word about why we do this before we go any further. Shoosmiths is a national law firm with 13 locations across the UK. Here in Scotland, we have a full service offering, and we are currently in a period of growth. Over the last 18 months, we've made senior appointments in connection with real estate, planning, employment, corporate, and dispute resolution, and we've opened up a new location in Glasgow. But as well as providing clients with innovative legal advice, we also strive to provide our clients and contacts with relevant thought leadership across a range of sectors. And with that in mind, I'm delighted to welcome a very special guest today in Andy Maciver to discuss the long-term economic outlook for Scotland against an ever-changing political backdrop. To explain the structure of our discussion today, we're going to break it down into three broad sections. The first will look at the current position, and that will take us up to the election on the 6th of May. Second, we'll look at the post-election period and the issues that any new administration may have to deal with. COVID recovery, the continuing impact of Brexit, and the possibility of a further independence referendum. And third, we'll look at the more long-term view of the economy and the political landscape in what's likely to be a post-referendum environment. We've received several questions from attendees, and I'm very grateful to those who have submitted questions. Rather than keep them for a Q&A at the end, the intention is to try and weave those into the discussion as and when the relevant topics arise. Now to introduce our guest. Andy Maciver will be a familiar face to many of you. He is the co-founder of Message Matters, the lobbying and PR consultancy. He's a political analyst and strategist and a commentator in the press, on TV and on the radio. Prior to founding Message Matters, he worked in the private sector and also the charitable sector, and he continues as a voluntary advisor to mental health and wellbeing charity Place to Be. So Andy, a very warm welcome this afternoon. Thanks for joining us to share your thoughts. To kick us off, I thought we'd turn our attention immediately towards the election. We're 16 days away from the parliamentary election. The polls are suggesting that the SNP are on course for victory. But what's your view about what the likely outcome is going to be in this election?
Straight into that one. You need 65 seats to get a majority in the Scottish Parliament. And the last three elections now have been characterised by a discussion as to whether or not the SNP will get that majority. They did in 2011, they didn't in 2016. And I think it's going to be extremely close. So I think they will get somewhere in the 60s. And my gut feeling is that they will just squeak enough, maybe just by one, to get the majority. But it will be extremely close. I think we have to remember the system, of course, is designed to avoid it. So the system is specifically designed to make sure there is no majority. It's a proportional representation system. It's rigged effectively for coalition government. So you're not supposed to be able to get one. It's supposed to be extremely hard. But I have a feeling they'll just sneak it.
So an indicator of the level of support that what is now a long-term government in Scotland has, that the likelihood is, or certainly a conceivable outcome is, that they do have a majority.
Yeah, and I think that it's worth reflecting on that level of support. I mean, you know, they've been in government now for 14 years. They are going to win this election and be the party of government, either as a minority or with somebody else, or as a majority. So they're going to be in power for 19 years anyway. And to have a level of support at potentially over 50% in some polls after that long in government is actually a bit of a global outlier. It's highly unusual for a party to be that popular this deep into a government.
And then let's look at the reasons for that then. We're probably in a relatively unique position, if you can have such a thing as a relatively unique position, in that one issue in the last 10 years has driven support for the SNP, and that is independence and the growing support for constitutional change. In terms of this election, are we looking at independence again being the key issue, or is COVID going to be an influential factor in this election?
I think it's a more independence-driven election than we've ever had before. So actually, if you look back to 2011, you had an SNP minority government from 2007, and the majority took everybody to a degree by surprise. So we weren't necessarily talking about independence, even though it's the election that led to the first referendum. We weren't actually talking about independence to quite the same degree as we do now. And then in 2016, because it was so fresh after the referendum, the manifesto commitment in the SNP manifesto was quite vague. It talked about an independence referendum if circumstances changed. It cited Brexit, of course, as one of those changes of circumstances. But this time, it's much clearer. Everybody knows what the election is about, and there's no question that it's massively driven by independence. And you can see in the first two televised debates, for those who've watched them, and you can see in all the coverage of what the campaigns are saying, that that is the issue that it's driven by. COVID drives the independence issue to a degree. So, for example, Nicola Sturgeon's poll ratings on COVID are very, very high, including support from quite a lot of unionists who think that she has done a better job on COVID than Boris Johnson, at least before the vaccine. That's certainly the evidence pre-vaccine. And that has driven some of the independence poll ratings as well. So if you look at COVID approval ratings, they are consistent with a rise in independence approval ratings. They won every single poll in 2020. And so you do see there's a correlation between the two things, but COVID drives independence rather than the other way around.
And actually, thinking about the issues that are going to come into play in this election, we've got independence there, and it's one of the questions that's been submitted, which is, says Alex Salmond, the supermajority, SNP and the ALBA party and another independence referendum, these all dominate the debate. Now we'll come on to speak about some of those issues shortly. But the end point to the question is, but what is the focus of the other party, and does anyone care? Now it might be worthwhile just running through each of the parties in turn. But if you take the Conservatives and Labour, traditionally the stronger of the opposition parties, in this election, what does a good outcome look like for those parties?
Well, it's a very unusual election in that nobody else is trying to win. So, you know, in normal terms, in the normal world, if you take the constitutional situation out of it, you come to an election and the leader of the opposition wants to win and become the leader of the country, the leader of the government. That's not happening here. So neither Douglas Ross nor Anas Sarwar are campaigning to be First Minister. They have both effectively, explicitly ruled that out. Douglas Ross is openly campaigning to stop an SNP majority. It's the same as Ruth Davidson did in 2016. So it's an unusual situation where there is only one candidate for First Minister. Success to the Scottish Tory party is stopping the party of government getting another majority. It's a pretty depressing situation if you look at it from a sort of neutral's point of view, and if you look at it from a democratic point of view, because this is not, we're not choosing leaders here, we're choosing a constitutional future. Douglas Ross, to go sort of party by party, Douglas Ross and the Scottish Tories, the campaign is extremely heavily based on Indie Ref 2. It's vote for us in the second vote. So let's remember, Scottish election, 2 votes, 1 a constituency vote, similar or the same as the Westminster system, first past the post. The other vote you get is on a regional basis, and you're voting for a party, not a person on that vote. And the Tories are campaigning for unionists all over Scotland to give them the party vote on the list, which they say, correctly, if enough people do that, will deprive the SNP of a majority. And they're not entirely wrong about that. Labour is trying to to a degree trying to avoid the constitutional question because they know that they don't really have a place in a polarised debate. You have one pole occupied by the SNP and the Nationalists, and the other pole occupied by the Tories, who are seen as being the most arch unionists. And the evidence of the last few elections is that if you sit in the middle of the road, you get squashed. And so what Anas Sarwar is quite cleverly doing is trying to sideline that issue and being the person who says, we've actually got other things to talk about here and we should be talking about them. And that's something that will probably serve him well for after the election, but probably not before. I think the Scottish Tories would be very happy with a result that has them only losing a few of the seats they have at the moment. And I think Labour would be happy with a result that only has them losing a few of the seats that they have at the moment. There is very little question that nationalist parties will have a majority, and quite a healthy majority. Whether it's a so-called supermajority, which is defined as 2/3 or not, is unknown and not that relevant, actually. The more relevant thing is, do the SNP get a majority by themselves? I think that's really the most relevant question.
And just looking at the performance of those opposition parties now, and even casting our minds back. So for the Conservative Party, in the 2016 election, I can remember the Ruth Davidson mantra of "smile until your faces hurt" that she told her candidates when they were on the campaign trail. And in the aftermath of that election, there seemed to be a feeling amongst the Conservatives that they could be the next government in Scotland at this election. Mm-hmm. Now, their chances of that seem to have receded markedly. And then take Labour, who typically have been a very strong party in Scotland and who are now even lower down on the standings than the Conservative Party. Now, there's two strands to this, but I suppose the first one is looking at the Conservatives. With that change just over one parliament, how big an impact do you think it's had that Ruth Davidson has stopped being the leader? She's stepped down and been replaced by Douglas Ross.
A bit, but I think it's overstated. So if you look back to 2016, Ruth Davidson was a very good leader. She had a completely different image to a traditional Tory. That helped a lot. She was engaging and she was a good debater, and all the things that we all know about Ruth Davidson certainly helped. But I think we should remember that the thing that helped Ruth Davidson the most was that she was seen as the leader of unionism in the immediate aftermath of the 2014 referendum. So she was in the right place at the right time. She was the right person, but she was also in the right place at the right time. And that is what helped. The Tories went from 16 seats, I think it was, to 31 between 2011 and 2016. That jump was in part to do with Ruth Davidson as a person, but it was far more to do with the constitutional situation and the fact that unionism was then able to ride the wave of the referendum, and the fact that a lot of people wanted to stop the SNP from trying to do it again, and a lot of Labour voters voted Tory, a lot of Lib Dem voters voted Tory, and that really helped them lift themselves up to 31 seats. It has changed a bit with Douglas Ross as leader, but it's the portrayal that this is all because it's not Ruth Davidson anymore, I don't think is correct. I think the biggest problem the Tories have is that it's a different era now. The vote for us to stop a second referendum is extremely popular amongst diehards, but it is no longer the attraction to the middle ground voter that it perhaps was in 2016. I think things have changed since then. Brexit's changed them a little bit, COVID has changed them a little bit, and just time has changed that a little bit as well. So I think that the issue the Tories have is that they hit their ceiling. The Tory party didn't do well in 2016 because it's the Tory party. In fact, quite the opposite. It did well because it was the Unionist party. But there will always be a ceiling in Scotland for support of a party called the Conservative Party. And they have hit that ceiling, and I think they're going to come down now. And you mentioned Labour, and it's quite important to bring them into that conversation because as the Tory vote gradually declines, which is what it's doing, the Labour vote is going to gradually increase. They have been squeezed out of the constitutional debate, as I mentioned before, because they've not been seen as having a credible constitutional position. They've not been seen as being strong enough in favour of the union, and so voters who are heavily motivated by the union are choosing to vote for the Tories and not Labour. That is beginning to change. A change of leadership in Labour helps that a lot. Jeremy Corbyn was extremely unpopular in Scotland, just as unpopular as he was throughout the rest of the UK. Keir Starmer, although he's having a difficult time acutely right now because of the vaccine, we'll probably get onto that later on, he will start to increase popularity, and with Anna Sarwar in charge of Labour here, you get the feeling of competence that people didn't have before. That, together with a more credible constitutional position, which they are developing, I think will see Labour's vote increase and the Tories' vote decline. I still see Labour as probably being the natural other party to the SNP. I think at the moment, the way the parties are structured, Labour is still the natural second largest party and not the Tories. I think the Tories have a foundation of sand for their vote, and I think we might not see it in this election, where I think they'll still stay second. They might not, but I think they'll stay second. But I don't think that will last much longer. I think Labour will overtake them.
And what of the traditional third party on a national scale in the pack of the Liberal Democrats?
It's a very difficult situation. It was a perfect storm for the Lib Dems going back 10 years. So they joined the coalition at Westminster, the Clegg-Cameron government, and there was immediate hit for the following year in the Scottish Parliament election. So it was only 1 year into the coalition that we had the 2011 Scottish Parliament election where the SNP got the majority, and the Lib Dems went down from 17 seats to 5, and they've never recovered. And the difficulty is that then came along with a very energetic constitutional campaign by both sides, where again the Lib Dems found themselves with no room. Lib Dems are a federalist party. Post-second referendum, if there is one, that could be very important and could actually form the basis of a solution. But for the moment, that in-between position just doesn't work electorally. So they've been unable to recover from the route that they had in 2011, which was because of them entering the coalition with the Tories in London. So they got down there and they just haven't recovered. And it's very difficult to see them coming back in because they're not able really to offer anything that nobody else is able to offer. Everything the Lib Dems can offer is largely offered by either Labour or the Tories. And so it's inevitable that not too many people are going to think to themselves, now's the time to vote Lib Dem. That sort of feeling just isn't out there. And it becomes increasingly difficult for them. I think that this gets us to the point that the Scottish Parliament is structured in an unsatisfactory way to get the right sort of result for people here. We took the Westminster party structure based on first past the post, and we lumped it into Holyrood, which is a proportional representation parliament. And what it has meant is that people's default voting patterns for Westminster have been carried through into the Scottish Parliament. And I think that the only future probably for a party like the Lib Dems, and for many of the parties in the Scottish Parliament, is actually one in which the pack is just shuffled completely, and we start to have political parties that are built for the Scottish Parliament and not transplanted into the Scottish Parliament as we've had before. Now that's something that does happen elsewhere in the world. In, for instance, Canada, you have federal parties who stand for the Parliament in Ottawa, and then you have provincial parties who stand in all the parliaments in the provinces, and they're not related to each other, they're different parties. So in Quebec, for instance, you have the Quebec Parliament, the Quebec Assembly, which is only populated by parties who stand in the Quebec Assembly. They have nothing to do with the parties who stand for Quebec in the federal parliament. That sort of future here is probably the only one that a party like the Lib Dems actually have, which is a reshuffling of the pack and a decision to, for example, come together, Willie Rennie and Anna Sarwar have a conversation and say, hey, what separates us? Not much. Why are we in different parties? Maybe we should do something else. And I think that is likely to be the only future for a party like the Lib Dems if they want to get back to the sort of level they were at before.
So interestingly, talking of reshuffling the pack and new parties coming in, we obviously do have a new party in the guise of the Alba Party, which is in the slightly odd position that it's a Scottish national party, but it has more MPs than it does MSPs. Yeah. What role do you think that they will have at this election? And I suppose there's maybe tiers to that question. The first is their leader, Alex Salmond. Do you think he will become an MSP? And then moving on from that, do you think they will get a sizable number of MSPs that could bear some influence in the Parliament?
The Alba question is has been a really interesting intervention, and I think that the first thing that we should probably do with Alba is take the personalities out of it and think about what's happened without people involved. What Alba has done is exactly what you would expect to happen in a proportional representation parliament. So this gets back a little bit to what I said before about transporting Westminster parties into Holyrood as we did 20 years ago. So we have a proportional parliament with 5 parties in it. If you look over to Scandinavia, the Swedish parliament has, I think, 9. The Norwegian and Finnish parliaments have 10, 11, 12 parties in them. The Danish parliament, I think, has 16 political parties in it. And what you get is you get a large party of the centre-left and a large party of the centre-right, and they basically compete for government with a group of other coalition partners around them. So what has happened here is very normal by European standards. So you would have a government, a nationalist-led government, with a couple of other nationalist parties probably supporting them and getting a minister or 2 each. So that's what you would expect to happen in normal circumstances. SNP win. They don't win a majority because you're not supposed to do that in proportional representation, but the Alba Party and the Green Party support them in government. They have a minister or 2 each, and that's how it works. That's actually very normal. What's not normal is when you introduce people into it. And the way that Alba has come about, obviously because of Alex Salmond being former First Minister, former leader, everything that's gone on over the last couple of years, makes that situation difficult to look at clinically and easy to look at very emotionally. So I think that's an important backdrop, though, is to look at it and say, it's not odd, it's not an abnormal situation, it's actually very normal for new parties to crop up and for smaller parties to be part of the system. However, we're not in a normal situation. And to answer your questions directly, I think that we're still quite early in the polling for Alba, it's fair to say. They're polling at, depending on where you look, anything from 3 to about 7%. The upper end of that is enough to return seats in that second ballot paper, the list system. It's enough to return 1 seat if you get about 6 or 7%. If you get the lower end of that, it's not enough to return a seat, but it is enough to influence who else gets the seats. And so there we come to the direct question. Is Alex Salmond going to be an MSP? I almost said SNP MSP, definitely won't be one of those. Is Alex Salmond going to be an MSP? I would say probably yes. He's standing in the northeast. That is where his power base is. He retains quite a lot of popularity there amongst nationalists. And I think there's a decent chance that yes, he will be returned as an MSP in a couple of weeks' time. If he's not returned as an MSP, you can almost guarantee there will be no Alba MSPs. Their success will start in the northeast with him. Will they get seats anywhere else? I think if they can ride a little bit of a Salmond wave and get that 6 or 7% nationally rather than just in his power base, then yes, you could see them getting a smattering of 4 or 5 MSPs. But I think, possibly the more profound impact of Alba will be, because they will get some votes, they will get at least 3-4% of votes. And what will that 3 or 4% do to the other parties who are vying for list seats? Who will they hurt? They're going to hurt somebody. There's only 56 list seats to go around. They're not going to create more just because there's a new party. So if Alba go in, somebody has to come out. And if Alba get votes, somebody has to lose votes. There's only so many to go around. In most places, that won't cost the SNP because they don't get list seats anyway. They get most of their seats from the constituencies. But it might cost, ironically, it might cost the unionist parties. It might cost the Greens. And in the south of Scotland, that's where the SNP are most worried about Alba because they have 3 list seats in the south of Scotland. The reason they have the list seats is because the Tories win constituencies there. So broadly speaking, the system means that if you win constituencies, you don't win the list. If you lose constituencies, you get some top-ups on the list. In the south of Scotland, if Alba take votes from the SNP, even if it's not enough to give Alba a seat, it might stop the SNP winning a seat, and it might stop an SNP majority. So you then have to look at the overall Alex Salmond narrative. So Alex Salmond is saying, we're here to create a supermajority. And intellectually, he's not wrong. If everybody who voted SNP in the list votes for Alba, they will create a supermajority. But in practice, he probably has as much chance of costing the SNP a majority than he has of creating a supermajority.
And so, just very briefly, 2 more questions before we move on to the next section. Where does that leave the Greens?
Again, it's very regionally based. So the Greens are in the exact same bracket as Alba, in that they are not looking at constituency seats. They're not even standing in most constituencies. They're a list-only party. They're only looking for the second vote or regional vote or party vote or whatever you want to call it. So they're in the same boat as Alba. At the moment, the SNP, let's say, for the sake of argument, they get 50% on the list because it's roughly where they are. They usually lose about 10% between the list vote, between the constituency vote and the list vote. They usually lose about 10%. That 10% largely goes to the Greens. So question number 1, how much of that 10% goes to Alba instead of going to the Greens? Alba and the Greens have a very different policy platform, on most obviously on something like transgender rights, which is quite a big campaign amongst people in the political world. But will people who are voting get down to that level of detail? I think probably not. They'll probably just think to themselves, I know not to vote SNP on the list because I know it's a waste and people are telling me that. So do I vote Green or Alba? So Alba will inevitably take some of those votes. Will it impact the Greens in certain areas where they only just got their list seat? Then yes, it could. But there's probably no reason to expect that it will hurt the Greens in terms of number of seats any more than it will hurt some of the unionist parties who also depend on the list to get their seats. It all depends on which region you're in, because you are ranked on the list from 1 to 7, and if you are number 7, if you get in last, then you're the one who's vulnerable to Alba, whether you're a Lib Dem or a Tory or a Labour or a Green. If you're last in, then you're vulnerable to Alba.
Okay, one last question on the first section, and this is one that's been submitted. Will Alba benefit where the SNP may not, because they don't have the term nationalist in their party name?
Well, interestingly, you've hit on a point that the SNP don't like, because the SNP don't have nationalist in their name either. They have national in their name, and they hate being called the Nationalist Party when they're actually the Scottish National Party. In fact, they frequently complain about it at Westminster. I don't think so, is the short answer. I think people know what they're voting for, really. You are not going to get people voting for Alba who, for example, might have previously been unionists but think, oh, here's a new party, I might give them a go. Everybody knows what they are. You know, they're getting enough national coverage now. People know who they're led by. They know what they are. And ultimately, we're talking here about transfers within communities. We're talking about Alba getting votes where they would previously have gone to another nationalist party. They're not getting votes that are coming over from the unionist community. So, no, I don't think so. I think people know who they're voting for. They know whether they're nationalists or unionists, and they'll vote according to whether they think they can work the system better than they have done in the past by changing their vote between constituency and list, or indeed for who they like as leader. Okay, so we've got, in our crystal ball gazing today, we've got a parliamentary arithmetic that looks like it will be a majority for pro-independence parties, if not a majority for the SNP. If we go beyond the election, then Parliament's made up. It will be one of the early tasks, potentially, of Parliament to seek to have a second independence referendum. To do so, under the current framework, they will need authorisation for that from the Westminster Government under a Section 30 order. What is the UK government's reaction? Well, at the moment, they don't know what their reaction, well, they know as individuals what they would like their reaction to be, but it is very unclear what it will be. So we will get the Section 30 request. It's going to happen, whether it's an SNP majority or a nationalist majority, there's going to be one. So we know we're going to have this coming down the road later this year. I would split the potential reaction of the UK government into 3. And these are the 3 camps that are currently operating in UK government, between the Scotland office, the Cabinet office, i.e. Michael Gove, who's extremely influential here and who we should bear in mind is, if you had to identify one person who might be a real decision maker in this, it's Michael Gove. So you've got the Scotland office under Alistair Jack, the Cabinet office under Michael Gove, and of course Downing Street under Boris Johnson. And between those three entities, there are three overlapping positions. I don't mean each one's got a position. There are three positions which run fluidly between all those places. So let's look at what they are. Loosely, position number one is no referendum. That's it. We had one in 2014. Once in a generation, etc., etc. We're not going through this again. You can ask as many times as you like. We're not doing it. It's a no. That's one position. And that's their public position right now. Because they have to say that to get their core vote out during the election. The core vote needs to feel energized by it, and so that's a position to get. There's an inconsistency with Douglas Ross saying you have to vote for us or there will be a referendum, but we'll put that to one side for now. So that's position number one. You're not getting one. On the other end of the scale, there is a position that says, look guys, if they vote for a referendum, if they express a wish for a referendum in the election where everybody knows that's what they're voting for, where it's very, very clear that voting for the SNP or for a nationalist party means voting for a referendum, you can't just say no, because what message are we sending to the world if we then say there is no democratic opportunity for this country to secede from the UK? That's not the sort of message we want to send to the world. So, try and be a bit less emotional about this. Use your head. Of course, we have to give them a referendum if they ask for one. Let's call that the 2011 position. It's exactly what happened in 2011. So there's those two. Then there's a third position, which is gaining a lot of currency, which is that they say, sure, you can have a referendum. That's fine. It will be in 2023 or 2024. And we'll use the time between now and then to negotiate the settlement. So the Scottish Government and the UK Government will negotiate the divorce settlement, and we will put that settlement to the people in a referendum. Now, they think this is a way to use the experience of the EU referendum, where, if you remember, a lot of leavers, or at least the narrative of a lot of leavers was, I didn't know what I was voting for. I wasn't voting for all of this mess. I was voting for something else. And they're going to use that narrative to say, well, we want to make sure this time people know exactly what they're voting for. There won't be any dubiety. There won't be any uncertainty. You'll be voting for the deal that we come up with. The subtext, of course, is we are going to do the most unimaginably awful deal that you would need to be heavily intoxicated to vote yes. It would be such a daft thing to do. So, there clearly won't be a currency share. We're going to cut off the BBC. You won't be part of the Commonwealth. You're not going to have the Queen as head of state. It's going to be an awful deal deliberately designed to make it impossible to vote yes, which I think comes with a lot of long-term issues. But those are the three positions: no, yes, or yes, but, I suppose is how you could summarize them. The big next question, don't want to preempt your question, the next question is what wins of those three positions? And at the moment, that's highly uncertain. Because we're right in the middle of an election campaign and the temperature is rather high, the Just Say No lobby is doing quite well. My feeling is that if we do get a majority for the SNP, in particular a single party SNP only majority, I do think that after the election that line will inevitably have to soften, and people will start to say, look, you can't just say no. It's just democratically illegitimate to simply say we're just going to completely ignore what potentially over 50% of voters in the constituency vote might ask for. So you made me put my money at the start on how many seats the SNP would get. If I had two buckets in front of me, one which is there will be a second referendum and one which says there won't be a second referendum, and you had me put my token in one of the buckets, I'd put it in there will be a second referendum.
So my next question could be a fairly short answer then. If there is a no approach, or at least certainly initially, and for maybe a sustained period, there's a no response from the Westminster government, would either an SNP administration majority or a nationalist overall majority, taking into account other parties, go it alone and hold a Catalan-style referendum?
Well, I think there's a short answer to that question, which is no. I think the longer answer to that question is that one thing the unionists do have correct is that if they just say no, they do put the ball back in the nationalist court and give them a temporary problem which will cause quite a lot of ruction in the nationalist community. Because Nicola Sturgeon's instinctive response to that will be to find some other democratically persuasive method to get through that issue. So there may be quite a lot of international tutting, for want of a better word, at the UK government if they deny that sort of democratic legitimacy. There might become quite a bit of international pressure on them. Other pressure will be heaped on them by the fact that I expect the Labour Party and the Lib Dems after the election to recognise the legitimacy of the call for a referendum and to come in behind it and support it, including Keir Starmer. I think they'll be very wary of jumping into a hole with the Tories of saying to Scotland, you're not getting this even though you voted for it. You know, the Tories have been there before. The Tories had a long period of exile in the 90s because they were out on a limb denying Scotland what it clearly wanted to have. And I think they will re-enter that period if they say no. I don't think Labour and the Lib Dems will make the same mistake. I think they'll start to say, well, look, you have to have a referendum. All of that then starts to put the pressure on the Tory government in London to eventually buckle and to say yes. A lot of Scottish Tories will say to them, you're making a mistake. You've got to let them have a referendum because in the long term, you're just going to kill us up here if you don't allow that to happen. So I think that's the Nicola Sturgeon viewpoint. She will also feel that if she has a wildcat referendum because of what happened in Spain, if there's a wildcat referendum, she damages herself in the eyes of the EU, a body that she wants to rejoin. You know, they will clearly not recognise that referendum, and she herself will know that it will damage her credibility as a global statesperson. So I think that she will clearly not want to go down that road. The difficulty is how much pressure is put on her by others in the nationalist movement, including, of course, Mr. A. Salmond, if he is an MSP at that point. How much pressure is put on her by the rest of the movement to push on and do something else more radical. She will have to manage that internally, and that could be quite difficult for her. But I think ultimately, the pressure from other legitimate sources is what she will hope would gradually change the UK government's mind, and she's probably right about that.
You mentioned as part of that answer about the Labour Party and the Liberals coming out more or less in favour of a referendum in the event that there is the parliamentary arithmetic which is in favour of a referendum occurring. One thing that strikes me, certainly in terms of how this referendum campaign, if there is one, will be fought, is that we'll have on one side, in terms of, if you like, the Yes campaign, we'll have Nicola Sturgeon as the figurehead. She'll lead the majority party and she'll be the one who puts the arguments across on that side. What about the other side? Because that's certainly a difficulty, I think, post-2014. It seems that in Scotland, all parties were punished for forming almost an unholy alliance, whichever side you actually sat on, whether you were Liberal, Conservative or Labour. Can that be resolved to have a unified unionist approach?
That is one of the big questions about this. And I think the situation is quite different to what it was in the first referendum. In the first referendum, Labour were still larger than the Tory party. They had more seats in Holyrood, significantly more seats in Holyrood. They had very, very significantly more seats in Westminster. The Tories only started getting good at winning seats in 2016 and 2017. They were no use at it before that. So you had a situation where Labour were clearly still the dominant Scottish Unionist party. And that made the leadership of the Better Together campaign easier. It was obvious it should be a Labour figurehead. And it was. Alistair Darling led the campaign, even though it was a Tory government, or Tory coalition government at Westminster. This time it's different, because the natural leaders of any Unionist campaign would be Tories, because they're the larger party up here. A lot of people talk about Ruth Davidson being that natural leader. The problem is that a lot of people in Scottish Labour think that their current problems are, I think they're wrong about this, I have to say. However, they think their current problems are all rooted in them being part of Better Together with the Tory party. And they will therefore probably run a mile from entering another cross-party campaign again. So what does that do? Well, the Electoral Commission needs an official campaign. You have to have an officially designated. If you remember back to the EU referendum where there was the fight between the Aaron Banks, Nigel Farage Leave movement and the Dominic Cummings Leave movement, Vote Leave and Leave.eu. And one of them won. They won the official designation, which gives a variety of controls over spending limits and all that sort of thing. So getting the official designation is quite important, and it also means that if you have a head-to-head debate on BBC Scotland or STV with Nicola Sturgeon against it's got to be against somebody, and it'll be against the official leader of the official campaign. So there has to be one. The only outcomes I can see to that is that each party creates its own campaign and attempts to get the designation from the Electoral Commission, which is a real bun fight at that point. Or there is a unified campaign, but not involving politicians, or at least not involving current serving politicians. So there'll be a unionist campaign that will be far more grassroots and will be led by a community figure or a famous figure who is not a politician. I think a lot of people will be looking at that right now and wondering whether or not that might be achievable as a way to create a single unified unionist campaign, but one which is not infected by party politics. But it's a big unknown about what's going to happen. Nobody really knows the answer to that question yet. And even for somebody like me trying to look at that and work out what the path through it might be for the unionist campaign, it's not an easy path through. There'll be lots of unionist campaigns, in short, I expect.
And if we move away from the, if you like, the structure of the campaign and look at the issues that are likely to arise, one of the questions that has come in is that it feels as if we are not closer to any key answers from the last independence referendum. Why do you think that is? So I suppose that really harnesses what the issues that will be at stake are. What are the issues that are going to be in dispute and the parties will be campaigning over?
I have a view on. We had a lot of discussion at the EU referendum about facts and politics, and all the broadcasters had their fact check service, and people said we just want facts. We want facts. Politics isn't about facts. There aren't that many facts in politics, is the truth. What there are is good people, leaders who give their interpretation of what they think will happen if you do the thing they're asking you to do. There is no fact around whether or not Scotland will be able to rejoin the EU after independence. There's not a factual answer to that question. There are people who think they have a factual answer to that question, but they don't. Because you can speak to one economist who'll say, yes, clearly they will meet the criteria, and you can speak to another who will say they don't. And I'll give you a guess which way those two will vote in the referendum campaign. So we are short of facts, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. People have to go with who they think is more believable and who they think has the best arguments. So we will conduct this referendum campaign along very similar lines to the next one. There will be a debate about currency. Can Scotland, should Scotland use the pound after independence? It's not a factual answer to that question. It doesn't exist. Will Scotland rejoin the EU? There's no facts. So that's one thing I didn't like about the EU. One of the many things I didn't like about the EU referendum campaign is we have this desire to go in search of facts where facts don't actually exist. What exists is assertion. And I don't mean that pejoratively. I think that's not a bad thing. What exists is assertion, and you have to make up your mind what you think is more believable and what's not. A lot of the same issues are going to come up. Currency is going to come up. The EU is going to come up. The customs union and all that, and the border and what might be affected by rejoining the EU, that's going to come up. The head of state will come up. The deficit is going to come up clearly as well. Oil will be mentioned, I'm quite sure, during the next referendum campaign. I don't think you're going to see the issues being fundamentally different to what they were in 2014. Actually, they'll be the same, and a lot of the answers will be the same as well. I don't think we should expect that some of the creases of 2014 will be ironed out. They're creases because they're creases.
And looking at a different aspect of the referendum, so that's the substantive issues. What about the issue of demographics since 2014? We're in a position where it's likely we'll have 16 and 17-year-olds voting in any future referendum as they did in 2014.
Yep.
How is that likely to play out in terms of the overall result?
Well, this is really interesting. And I think it's an area where the unionists have their head in the sand about this, because actually demographics will tell you that the longer you wait, the less chance you've got of winning if you're a unionist. Children who were 6 years old at the last independence referendum, if this one is held at about the same time scale after the election, children who were 6 years old the last time will be able to vote in this one, and they're all going to vote yes, because that's what the demographics tell us, that's what polling tells us. Young people will break anything upwards of 80% for yes. Yes wins in every age bracket until you get to 55 years old. Unionist voters, let's be completely blunt about this, unionist voters are dying and nationalist voters are coming of age. That is what is happening. That is a fact. There's a fact in politics. That's indisputable. That's what's happening. Every poll will tell us that. The other things the polls tell us, which is really interesting, and none of these are good news, for those who are watching us today who have a unionist disposition, it's a sort of cover your ears time. It used to be the case, again, I'll be completely generalist about this. Obviously there are anomalies and outliers, but let's be generalist about it. If you were female, you voted no in larger numbers than if you were male. But this time, females are breaking yes. So something about what's happening is making females more likely. Females, generally speaking in politics, political research over many, many years will tell us that females are more risk averse than males when it comes to major political change. Not so anymore for this. So basically, the Yes campaign used to have a problem with women voting for it, no longer. They're now ahead in women. If you had money or the prospect of having some money, you voted no in 2014. That's what you did. Not now. ABC1 social class is now breaking for yes, where it used to break for no. So all of the demographic indicators are pointing towards favourability towards yes. There isn't a demographic indicator that's good news for the no campaign. There's not one. And because of that, logically, the longer you leave it, the longer you put it off. Not only do you alienate more people who might have previously voted no and will move into voting yes because they feel the UK government's being intransigent or whatever, but you actually are asking for demographic trouble because your voters are dying and their voters are getting older. Now,
we're going to have to deal with the post-referendum period, but before we do, just want to touch on one other thing. The referendum issue, so independence against the status quo, is a pure binary position, where you're one thing or you are the other thing. Is there anything out there in the political landscape which can bridge that gap, which almost a compromise, which can either appease or satisfy both parties?
Yeah, the short answer is there definitely is. And it's what a sort of political geek like me would call federalism, which means nothing to most people. But it is what we might more colloquially refer to as the middle option. It was polled for a while back in about 2012, 2013. There was a really interesting situation went on with Alex Salmond and David Cameron, where behind the scenes in about 2012, Alex Salmond said to David Cameron, if you put a third option on the ballot paper, if you want a third option on the ballot paper of what he called Devo Max, let's forget about all the terminology, it's one of the middle options. If you put that on the ballot paper, I'll back you, I don't mind. I'm happy to have a Devo Max option on there. And it's a fascinating historical issue because it was a mistake, in my view, by Alex Salmond to offer that. And it was a mistake by David Cameron to say no, which is what he did. He said no, don't want it, want a straight yes, no. If David Cameron had said yes, you would have had a first part of the ballot paper, much like the referendum in 1997 for devolution, where you said yes or no to devolution, and then you had the tax varying power question. You would have had a first question saying independence, yes or no, If you say yes, then that's it. Don't need to worry about that. If you say no, do you want Devo Max or the status quo? If that had happened, in my view, and I think in the view of most pollsters, you would have had a larger vote in favour of no, because a lot of yes voters would have realised that they had another option had they voted no. So you would have had a larger vote in favour of no. I think possibly up to 65-70% actually in favour of no. And then a massive overwhelming vote in favour of Devo Max over the status quo. And I think that has receded to a degree in that nobody's really talking much about the middle option just now, apart from Keir Starmer's just started to. But I do think, even though people might not know it, I largely think it's probably what people in the country actually want. I mean, if you're sitting around the dinner table at Christmas time in 2006 and somebody says to you, how do you fancy a phone that you just have to touch and it can have the internet on it and it can have all these other sorts of things on it, it's not just a phone. Do you fancy that? People might say, don't know, I don't really know what that is, I'm not really sure I want that. A year later, everybody's buying iPhones for Christmas. Sometimes people don't know what they want until you come up with something and offer it. And I actually think that the Labour Party is in the best position to be trailblazers here when it comes to that, because I think that Keir Starmer has quite rightly identified that if you want to hold the UK together, you're probably going to have to create a new vision of what the UK looks like. And that means a looser, you can call it federalism, you can call it Devo Max or Devo Plus or Home Rule, or there's a lot of things you can call it. But what it is a looser version of the UK, where each individual nation has, including England, by the way, has significantly more power than it does right now. They're in control of many more taxes, many more of their affairs, almost everything apart from probably foreign affairs and defence and maybe a few other things. But it's a UK that remains together, but it's a lot looser. And it is likely that that is, in the long term, the only future the UK actually has. And I do think it's one that could be very popular with people in Scotland.
Okay, so we're at UK to survive must change. And the alternative is, well, we're probably going to have to answer the question on the alternative in an independence referendum, which brings us on to the final point, which we're running slightly close to the end of time. So I'm going to ask you two questions which have been submitted. I'm going to see how quickly you can answer them. They're quite lengthy. So the first is, any thoughts on Scotland's financial policy if independence was successful? This question, our questioner would like to understand how the country will be able to afford to go it alone. And the second question, which links into this, is what are the economic levers frequently referred to by the SNP and those that seek independence that can be pulled following independence to mitigate any potential downside economic impacts, such as those noted in the government's own GERS reporting? So if you can, in a very brief period of time, Andy, really what are the things a new administration would look to do to make Scotland economically viable and successful post-independence?
I think post-independence, what you immediately get is a reinventing of politics around ideology rather than around constitutionalism. And so the economic policy of a post-independent Scotland will very much depend on who's in charge, ideologically. Do they go left or do they go right, to be completely crude about it? I think that we're going to have a situation, this is about your perception of risk and how much you want to balance risk. Everybody pretty much now accepts, including nationalists on the sort of moderate wing of the SNP, now accept that there will be a short-term hit as a result of independence. That's not a particularly controversial thing to say anymore. It was all over Andrew Wilson's Growth Commission report. The question, I think, for people is the short-term risk worth it, or is it not, for what you might have in terms of long-term gain? And everybody will be in a different place on the risk spectrum in terms of answering that question. So the policy of an independent Scotland will be completely based on who's in charge. You know, I might argue that Ruth Davidson or Douglas Ross might have a different vision of what that ideological economic policy might be than, say, somebody like Nicola Sturgeon might have. And it will be very much based on that. The other part of the question was what? Remind me.
The
second bit.
Well, the other part was economic levers that are referred to by the SNP.
The economic levers, again, it depends who you speak to. A lot of the SNP people who are referring to economic levers are just using political terminology to say they don't have enough power over things that they do have enough power over. Those who are being more literal and perhaps more thoughtful about it are probably talking about a variety of other taxes, including VAT and corporation tax in particular, that they think may help them create a differential economy. And on that, they have a point, particularly in corporation tax, for instance. That's been devolved to Northern Ireland for a very specific reason, in order that they can compete with the low corporation tax in the Republic. And so there is a point to be made on that. There are more economic levers that Scotland could benefit from, but not everybody who says that in the SNP is referring to that. Some of them are making a political point rather than an economic point.
Okay. Andy, I have got 5 quick-fire questions I'm going to put to you before we bring this session to a close. So I'm going to ask you to pull out the crystal ball again.
Yeah.
Imagine we're in the year...
I hope we're not recording.
In the year 2026, and it's the end of this upcoming Parliament at Holyrood. Question 1, is Scotland an independent country?
No.
Question number 2, is there a deal or no deal with the rest of the UK, on the assumption that we are independent?
If we're independent, then yes, there will be a deal, because I think the UK government will learn the lessons of Brexit and behave itself and accept a loss.
And if we are independent, is Scotland a member of the EU?
No. But I think it might be a member of the European Free Trade Association.
And if we are independent, who's the First Minister?
On the basis that an independence referendum has been won, I think it will still be Nicola Sturgeon.
And who's the Prime Minister?
Keir Starmer.
Andy, thank you very much. I really appreciate your input and your thoughts today. For everyone watching, thank you. I understand that this is going to be available online to view again if anyone should wish to revisit any part of it. Andy, once again, thank you very much.